Good afternoon and welcome to Gladstone's Library. It's an exciting day for us. We're going to unveil the plans of our £7.7 million project. If I say it quickly, it doesn't sound so bad. But and after the panel discussion, there will be tea, and alongside tea, in our lecture room, there will be the plans on shows. So do go, look at them, comment on them, change them, do whatever you like. But it's important that we get your feedback on them. So please come and have a look, discuss, tell us, and enjoy. But now to the panel. I'm going to hand over to Gregory Cameron, who is your Master of Ceremonies this afternoon, and he's going to introduce the panel. Gregory.
Thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon to all of you. It's a delight to welcome you to the noisy calm and the quiet enthusiasm of Gladstone's Library this afternoon. And welcome to what I think will be a deceptively straightforward event with planned spontaneity and relaxed intensity as we discuss the topic set for this afternoon. Things, for me, are simply complicated as I introduce our panel and chair a discussion on the topic of liberal faith and oxymoron. Well, faith is often referred to as blind, the acceptance of impossible revelations and unquestioning obedience to the revelation of an unknowable God, whereas liberalism implies a latitude of belief and permissiveness, a readiness to allow for relativity with a premium based on human experience. So can they belong together? Do they remain divided? Is it absolutely an oxymoron to talk about liberal faith? To discuss these questions and your own questions later on, we have a very distinguished panel. To my left is Professor Linda Woodhead, MBE, and Linda is a Christian and an academic, a student and teacher of sociological sciences who has brought sociological disciplines and perspectives to a hard-headed analysis of how religion works in our culture. Linda is the author of many books and is someone who delights in debate and argument, and indeed has been the co-founder with others of the recent series of Westminster Faith Debates, debating religion in the public forum. Linda is co-director of the Institute for Social Futures at Lancaster University and a prophetic voice about the future of religion in a contemporary world. On my right is Andrew Copson, who is a contemporary humanist, a columnist and a broadcaster. He's been the public face of the British Humanist Association since 2010 and a formidable exponent of humanist perspectives across all types of media. He's a strong advocate of a robust education system in our country. His humanist beliefs have seen him chair the Westminster Standing Advisory Council on Religious Education and to serve as a trustee of the National Religious Education Council. Committed to internationalism, he has represented humanist beliefs to the Council of Europe, and he may well have some pertinent comments about recent developments in British politics. Also to my right is the Very Reverend Dr. Martyn Percy. Martyn is a Christian and Dean of an Oxford college and cathedral which was founded by a 16th century liberal humanist who also happened to be a pompous prelate, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. After a distinguished academic career in theology, Martyn earned fame and maybe even a little notoriety as a theological educator for priests in the Church of England, where he has resisted the tendency of the Church of England to reach for managerial models of leadership. He is an advisor to the British Board of Film Classification and a director of the Advertising Standards Authority, where I'm sure he's learned to spot truth from spin. Zia Chaudhry, to my left, is a British-born Muslim who grew up in Liverpool as part of a family who made their home among us from Pakistan. After being called to the bar in 1991, Zia has specialised in criminal law, but he's also been prominent in interfaith dialogue, seeking to promote understanding of the nature of Islam and Islamic culture. He was instrumental in establishing the House of Wisdom here in Gladstone's library, a reading room for the library's Islamic collection, and is a co-founder of the Spirit of Cordoba, a charity which seeks to rekindle a spirit of cooperation between the Abrahamic faiths. In 2013, Zia published an autobiographical series of reflections on his own life and growing up called Just Your Average Muslim. Although we may discover this afternoon he is anything but. It's with great pleasure I invite our panel to begin this discussion, and we're going to do so by asking them each to give a short perspective on the question in front of us. Linda.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. One of the interesting things about liberalism is that you can't define it in terms of liberty. Lots of people love liberty. Donald Trump loves liberty, genuinely loves liberty. Anarchists do. Libertarians do. But you wouldn't call any of them liberals. In fact, I don't think you can really define liberalism in terms of any concept or doctrine or dogma, because it's a lived practice. At its heart, at the heart of this lived practice, I want to put to you, is creative conflict. Liberals don't run away from conflict. They try to turn it to constructive rather than destructive ends. One of our most powerful symbols of that is the debating chamber in the House of Commons, which, as you probably know, is a chapel. It started as St. Stephen's Chapel. That's why it's got two sides where you'd have sit to pray and the speaker sits where the altar was. And that's not coincidental. That was the appropriate place to be given to the debating chamber. There, people meet in adversarial debate of a very heated nature. Different parties are there representing different and completely conflicting interests in the whole country, accountable to all the people. Debate, robust debate, and then decisions by a majority vote. And the majority carries it. And liberalism means that even if that wasn't your view, you abide by that decision with grace. That's one example. Another example would be good academic debate, healthy governing bodies, checks and balances, bodies that are run on similar lines. And actually, when you think about it, they're everywhere. They're deeply embedded in our lived practices at all sorts of levels. They imply certain things about human beings and their nature that I won't go into. But I think it's the practice that's central, and actually you can read off certain other commitments from that practice. Now let me just talk, when it comes to the faith part of our debate, let me just talk about my own church, which is the Church of England. Because at its best, I think the Church of England was open to, not all of England, but a good part of England, a whole range of society, of classes, of interests. It embraced a whole range of theology, from the very Catholic to the very Protestant, and thought that was a strength, and tried to work with that pluralism and that difference rather than eliminate it for a single set of revealed truths that everyone agreed on. It interlinked with the whole of society, from Parliament at the top to the local parish council at the bottom. And in its constitution, it was delicately balanced between clergy and laity so that no one was in control. And that wasn't an accident. And it was open to scholarly debate. It's deeply tied up with our schooling system and, of course, with our universities. Now, I actually feel, and I've just got a book coming out about this, that it has departed from that deep theological conviction that debate and conflict is at the heart of what religion is, and what Christianity is. But nevertheless, it's not an oxymoron. We do have a liberal faith. It did hold up those ideals. To some extent, it still maintains them, and perhaps one day it can return to some of that liberalism with real conviction.
Thank you very much, Linda. Zia?
Liberal Islam certainly is an oxymoron to many people, but it wasn't always the case that that's how Islam was perceived. Go back 1,000 years, and a lot of the criticism of Muslims was that they were too liberal, described as lascivious and indulgent, stark contrast to what we have today. You had interpretations of the faith that were very liberal, theological debates where anything could be contested, even questions as fundamental as, does God exist? Now try having that debate in many Muslim countries today. It wasn't just theological debate, it was practical problems as well that were met with liberal solutions, and there are countless examples of liberal interpretations of religious edicts. This particular example may or may not be true, but it's a famous one of a Muslim judge who was approached by an aggrieved person who said that so-and-so has killed my relative and I want his death in return. And the judge looked into this and said, look, it's not really a death penalty type of case. And the man was insistent. He said, no, I demand justice. Wasn't going to take no for an answer. And the Muslim judge eventually relented and said, that's fine. You want justice. You're going to have to kill his relative in exactly the same way that your relative died, which, bearing in mind, was because he fell out of a tree and landed on him, might be somewhat difficult for you to achieve, but you're entitled to it by way of justice. And there are plenty of examples of judges seeking the most liberal interpretation possible. But I would suggest that that sort of liberal approach thrives in certain conditions, in certain situations. And when I talk about 1,000 years ago and Cordoba and Muslim Spain, and the liberal approach of Muslims, of course, the situation of Muslims, the condition of Muslims was very different. Because I would suggest that liberalism thrives where there's prosperity, peace, stability, and education. Very few of those are associated with the Muslim world today, sadly. And when we do look at the Muslim world today, we find, of course, variations from the generally liberal approach of communities and countries like Malaysia and Far Eastern or Southeast Asian Muslims as compared to Middle Eastern. And somebody once made this point, that the seeds of liberalism, the seeds of freedom existed in Islam, but they fell on ground which wasn't fertile. And that's an interesting example to ponder, because there were, even historically, differences between the nomadic Bedouin harsh interpretations, and their lifestyle demanded harsh interpretations, as compared to the mercantile cosmopolitan cities where a greater degree of flexibility was required. I would describe myself as a liberal Muslim, but then I come from a background of stability, security, education, and I'm comfortable in my faith. I don't feel threatened. I'm able to be liberal. But when people feel threatened, their liberalism is threatened. And that, I say, not just as a Muslim. Of course, I would say that many Muslims today are sheltering behind conservative shields because they feel threatened. But it doesn't just apply to Muslims. We've only to see what's happened in the last 10 days here, what's happening in Europe and has happened for some years now, and of course the events over the pond. So the challenge to me is to create those conditions that enable liberal faith to thrive.
Thank you very much, Zia. Andrew?
The cluster of questions that we were invited to consider under the heading of the talk today included ones about whether or not the torch of liberalism, of liberal values, had passed in recent decades from some denominations of religion to non-religious people. And I think I'd like to start with that. The growth of the non-religious, both in terms of identity and in terms of beliefs and in terms of practice in the last few decades, has been the biggest demographic shift in relation to religion or belief that has occurred. And simply at the level of social attitudes and values, it is certainly true that liberal values today are more associated with a non-religious approach to life than with a religious one. So on the big issues of choice, social, ethical issues of choice that confront us today, like, for example, debates around abortion, like, for example, debates about assisted dying for those who are terminally ill, also attitudes of prejudice and discrimination. In all of those areas, the liberal position, the position in favour of individual choice and autonomy, is much more strongly associated with a non-religious worldview than others. There's a slight exception for assisted dying for the terminally ill, which is now so close to being a consensus in society that 72% of Christians also agree with it. But 92% of non-religious people do. And that gap between what religious people generally take as their view on an ethical issue and what non-religious people generally take as their view on an ethical issue, with the non-religious favouring the liberal position, is very obvious. It's too early quite to do a full analysis of the recent referendum that we have experienced. But again, people who self-define as Christian, of all the groups, religious groups that have been analysed in voting in the referendum, were the most likely to vote to leave the European Union. Now, of course, there is an association there with age, which might be the more decisive factor. Of course, Christians tend to be much older than other people in society. But nonetheless, pretty reliably, that's the case. I think that to some extent, it always has been the case that many figures that have carried liberalism forward as an idea, certainly since the 19th century, have been non-religious people. Obviously, there are many religious people like Gladstone himself who championed these causes, but many of those who provided the intellectual heft for that political movement, people like John Stuart Mill, who was highly involved with humanist organisations in London, Harriet Law, who spoke from platforms of the free thinkers at the time. I was very lucky to be able to look at some of the papers and pamphlets of Bradlaugh in this library this morning, the great atheist liberal MP of the 19th century. Many of those people have, and still are, been strongly associated with the development of liberalism as a political idea. And I'll come back to that in a moment, because I don't think that we should talk just about liberalism as if it's a sort of a proclivity on some questions of choice and dignity. It is a fully worked out approach to life and to politics and to the human being and to the human community, and one I think that sits uneasily with religion and much more easily with a non-religious approach. Why has liberalism, the torch of liberalism, shifted from those who see themselves as religious to those who see themselves as non-religious, if it has? I think there are a huge possible number of factors in this. Certainly, I think the collapse since the 19th century, at least, the collapse in non-conformity and the free churches movements that were strongly associated with liberal politics, especially in certain geographical areas in Britain, the almost collapse in relative terms of those denominations, I think has taken a lot of liberal instincts out of the religious sphere. This is true in a national way. Of course, you get those areas in the census 2001-2011, those areas that had very high proportions in the 19th century of non-conformity now have the highest proportions of non-religious people in the country. So that's a wider social move as well as a move that individuals might make. And I think that that same thing that has happened in our history, that people have gone from being, in certain areas, Church of England to non-conformist to non-religious, and that liberal values have been amplified as those changes have occurred, also takes place on an individual level as well. So notwithstanding what we've just heard about a liberal approach to Islam, it's certainly the case today when we work at the British Humanist Association with, for example, apostate groups, people who are moving away from the religion that they were raised in, and also liberal Muslim groups. Very often you want to have one of the people from the liberal Muslim group to come and talk at your event, because you met them 5 years ago from a liberal Muslim group, so you email them and you invite them to come, and you find out that actually in the intervening 5 years they've moved away from religion completely, and the trajectory that they were on that took them from a very strong interpretation of religion in their youth to a very liberal interpretation has then taken them into a completely non-religious view of the world, and I think that's extremely common. As a way of behaving, the attitudes associated with it as a worldview, as a way of thinking about human beings, not as creations but as organic beings. John Stuart Mill has this wonderful phrase in On Liberty, which of course is a political manifesto but is also so much more about the human being. And he says the human being is not a machine that's been created to do a certain thing. It's more like a tree, something that develops, is an organic. And this is a very liberal idea, which is really quite at odds in quite a fundamental way with the idea that human beings are a special sort of creation, this alternative way of thinking about human beings, that instead they're a developing organism. A view of the human community that sees it as to some extent carving out a society that functions in the here and now, in an otherwise indifferent universe, a community where facts don't come from authority and rules for living don't come from commandments, but instead they're worked out by human beings as a result of discussion and consensus. I think that all of these ideas that constitute liberalism sit much more easily with a worldview from which God and religion is absent than they do with one where that is a present force.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And over to Martyn.
Thank you, Gregory, very much indeed. Good afternoon to you all. So just a little illustrative joke to begin with, and then some remarks, and then a few things to sum up. So, first of all, the joke. There was a day in heaven when the queues to get in were backed up very substantially, so much so that the angels on the pearly gates started to panic, because you have to be admitted to heaven on the day that you die. And there was a danger of this not happening. So the angels fly into the centre of heaven and they meet with Jesus and say, what are we going to do about this traffic jam at the pearly gates? And Jesus says, well, I'm not sure, but I think what I'll do is I'll come to the gates myself and I'll ask everybody a question. And depending on how they answer, they can either come in straight away or we'll put them in purgatory for a while. Okay, so the angels, great, that's good. What's your question? Well, says Jesus, I'm going to do the question from Matthew 16. Who do you say that I am? And depending on how they answer, they can either come straight in or they can wait. Great, say the angels, let's go. So the first person at the gates is a Catholic priest, recently martyred. Who do you say that I am? And the Catholic priest begins as follows. Well, our new Pope says, and Jesus says, I'm going to stop you right there if you don't mind. I'm well aware of what the Pope thinks about me and about heaven. I ask you for your view, really, not the view of your denomination. Would you like to wait over there, please? Next up, a fundamentalist preacher. Who do you say that I am? Well, the Bible says, yes, says Jesus, quite so. Yes, I'm well aware of what the Bible says. Had a hand in writing some of it myself. Look, if you don't mind, go and wait over there with the Catholic. Next up, a Methodist minister. It's been a bad day for ministers. Who do you say that I am? And the Methodist minister says, well, at a conference last year, we were discussing exactly this question. And yes, says Jesus, stifling a yawn, I'm well aware of Methodist conference deliberations, if you don't mind, over there with the others. And then an Anglican priest. Who do you say that I am? And the Anglican priest looks Jesus dead in the eye and says, you are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God. And there's this awkward pause because Jesus wasn't really expecting this answer from an Anglican and is about to say, come in, friend, right away, when the Anglican says, you know, then again, on the other hand. So, pause, deliberate. Oxymorons, as you know, are figures of speech which produce incongruous and sometimes seemingly self-contradictory pairs of words. Cruel kindness, make haste slowly. Now, the strange thing about this is, of course, we actually do understand what those things mean, even though they are self-contradictory. And I would add, on Anglicanism, passionate coolness. We all understand what that means. Anglican isn't cool passion, it's passionate coolness. It's also got scope for faithful doubt. It's also guilty as charged of bold hesitancy. Now, I don't say for a moment it's the only denomination that does this, but it does it, and it does it quite well. And I would say to you that actually oxymorons, particularly when you think about liberalism, are not there to be deconstructed. They are, in other words, not problems to be solved. They are dilemmas that contain us. And it is the exploration of a dilemma that actually enables society to be civil and broad and appropriate. So what do I think liberalism is, and what is liberal faith? A story. 60 years ago, a professor in the University of Leuven was supervising a graduate student on the subject of feasts. And one of the questions in the thesis was, how do children from the age of 9 to 11 understand the concept of feast? And the supervisor set another question for the student. See if you can do some research amongst children of the ages of 9 to 11 on what their ideal birthday feast looks like. The researcher set about this with 3 pictures. Firstly, a picture of one child, like a stick picture, but with lots and lots of presents. Picture 1. Picture 2, a small family, a table with some jelly and ice cream, birthday cake, but just one present to open, and not a very big one at that. Picture 3, friends, neighbours, hangers-on, people who are unwelcome, all the people who come to church sometimes, friends, relatives, all gathered, lots of food, but no presents. Which picture do you think the children chose as being the ideal birthday? 70% of the sample chose picture 3. Because they argued it was the only picture in which everybody was happy. The only picture in which as many people as possible were included. It, in other words, made the ideal birthday feast. Now, liberalism does not have a monopoly on inclusiveness. It does not have a monopoly on feasting. But it does have some understanding of what it takes to bring a world and a people and a society together, and that is true in faith as well. It seems to me that one of the great problems over the last, well, I would say the post-war era, is that the church, and perhaps particularly the Church of England, has allowed itself to be robbed of its old map and have it replaced with a new map. The old map, if you like, another story, was the bishop would ring you up and say, you've got a vacancy, I'm going to give you a vicar, what do you fancy? I do high, middle and low. And of course people would say, well, I think middle really, if you don't mind. They'd go for that kind of temperate, Laodicean, kind of mid-range kind of person. All things to all people. But that map has gone. Now your bishop rings up and says, what do you fancy? Left or right? Catholic or evangelical? Liberal or conservative? And the broad, the middle, has been entirely out-narrated and re-narrated as being liberal. I regard myself as orthodox. I happen to hold progressive views on sexuality and progressive views on gender. I don't hold anything other than normal Christian views on the ascension, resurrection and incarnation. But I am classed by my own denomination mostly as a liberal. Why? I don't hold any liberal doctrinal views, just normal progressive views on a range of important social and moral issues. The broad middle has been washed away by the left and the right, by the evangelical and the Catholic, and the broad re-narrated as liberal, and then liberal has been given a negative value. It's not a good thing to be liberal. And I just put it to you that actually one of the interesting things for the 21st century in politics, in society, certainly in the church, is the reclamation of the term broad and middle and open and therefore liberal. It's a really important thing for us to do. It's not a party. It's something that's about holding the middle ground. And that's why my own oxymoron for good Anglicanism or good liberalism is generous orthodoxy. I'm back to my feast. Orthodox and generous. Room for all. Room for people who half believe, who think they fully believe. They're disillusioned, of course. But people who think that actually there's space here for all of us to get on. That should be the church. That should be faith. That should be society. Generous orthodoxy. A dilemma, a framing, but also a vision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martyn. Well, we've had 4 very profound perspectives, and 4 perspectives that come very much from the experience and background of our speakers. I wondered whether I sensed a certain unanimity there, in that I almost detected an elegy for a religion which has gone, a sense of a passing of liberal faith, be it Christian or Muslim, and the standard passing to humanism, very strongly articulated by Andrew. Is that fair, Linda?
In this country, I have to say as a sociologist, it's what the numbers show. Andrew's right about that. So every generation, it's slow and inexorable, but every generation is about half as likely as their parents to be Christian. And it's been happening for a long time. And people who are brought up no religion now stay that way. whereas those brought up Christian are likely to shift from it. And Andrew's right too, that people who have no religion are more liberal on those moral issues. I think the one thing I disagree with is that, I have to disagree with something that Andrew says. I think he's still defaulting to the view that liberalism is about freedom, because you're taking those issues about I'm free to live my own life as your indicators of liberalism, and you even took a Brexit vote as an indicator of illiberalism. And I don't think it's that simple. So I think it may be that younger people have a very strong belief in freedom, that they're free to express themselves and fight for their identity, and that needs to be respected. But I don't think they're necessarily as good as at the bit of compromising. Debating, compromising. Actually, if you lose a vote, you lose a vote. You know, you can't have another referendum. Sorry, it's not a driving test. You can't go on until you get the right result. Democracy means I didn't vote for that, but that's what the majority want, and so I'm going to live with it and I'm going to make the best of it. And I'm not sure that that kind of liberalism, liberal democracy, is actually the preserve of the no-religious and the younger generation.
I think that's partly right. I want to resist the idea that I'm only talking about liberalism as being made up of freedom, because I think there's something more important behind it. I think that if you believe in freedom and you believe in an individual's right to choose, you're saying something more profound about what you think human dignity is. You're saying that human beings are such creatures as best flourish when they're given choices, when they're given the opportunity to make their own lives, when they're given those responsibilities. And whether you believe that's right or not, I think that's what you're saying when you say that you defend a liberal view. It's not just freedom; it's something more behind it. But I also agree with you that, and I think that certainly plenty of research shows that when young people are saying that another person should be free to choose, they are basing that assertion on those values. However, I agree that the more participatory give and take liberalism of the political community, I don't think that's as strongly associated with a religion versus non-religious divide. In fact, I think you could. Well, we need some research. But I think you might make a case for saying that people who participate in institutions like, for example, the Anglican Church get a lot more practice in that sort of give and take and liberalism and practice than others. But that would be an artifact of the fact of the nature of the institution rather than religion per se, I think.
Yeah.
Martyn.
So I think, this is all very well, but I think at the same time we need to ask a question, freedom, but freedom for what and for whom? So we're on the back of our Brexit vote. We're now looking at a very interesting situation developing in the USA in relation to their own voting there. And there's some nice research at the moment done by a man called Michael Baroni, who's looked at the profiling of Donald Trump supporters, who he roundly says, are not actually necessarily the caricatures of ill-educated blue-collar workers that you might think they are from reading your newspapers. But they are, he says, interestingly, low in what Robert Putnam and Charles Murray call social capital. In other words, they're not joiners. They're not part of communal groups. They are, if you like, angry barflies, individualists. And there is, I think, sometimes a confusion here between freedom and individualism. I put this together, of course, with other research which has been going on for some years now that shows that joining any group as a volunteer, including a church, adds 2 years to your life. Because actually hanging out together is basically good for us. And I've now realised, of course, this is what makes Donald Trump supporters so angry. Basically, they have 2 years less life expectancy as a result of being angry barflies. So they need to get with it and join things. But interestingly, of course, this is why Trump supporters have no penetration amongst Mormons. I mean, almost negligible, because they hang out together thickly and very well indeed. So one thing I think we might discover in relation to liberalism here actually is that this is a freedom not for individualism, but actually to be together and to work out what that means. Because the research isn't saying you have to believe things, it says actually you have to join things. And that's where churches could be very good again, which I know Linda's done work on. But
I want to come back to Linda and Zia again, but Andrew, there were times when you were shaking your head there.
Well, Linda probably was shaking. Were you not shaking your head as well? That's a shame.
Not as vigorously
Not
as
as
you.
vigorously as it wasn't just the thought of Donald Trump. Well, I think that there is a problem in making conclusions on evidence from the United States where there is such a lower level of engagement with community groups than there is in the UK. So I think that the UK is very different from that. But maybe I don't think I was shaking my head with any passion. Maybe I was agreeing with it. I think I was agreeing with you, actually. I mean,
It's just the fear of Donald Trump, let's be honest.
Yeah, exactly. It's just Donald Trump. I suppose I think that it's certainly the case. There's plenty of evidence for this, and that's quite right, that engagement with other people in joint enterprises or in community is very good for your well-being and very good for human flourishing. But I think that I don't see that liberalism leads to an individualism that negates that. I don't see that quite so much, because I think if liberalism is anything, it's saying something about human beings and their relationship to other human beings. So I think that the sort of individualism that we talk about, which isn't really a sort of a consequence, it seems, of the economic system rather than the social political system, I think that liberalism needs to lead to individualism. I think quite the opposite.
Right. Zia, do you want to offer a perspective on this?
Just on the idea of this being an elegy for something that's past. I hear what Andrew says, but mosques are overflowing, more mosques are being built, and the younger generation are not drifting away from Islam. They're saying their parents weren't Muslim enough. Yet, they're more conservative. They haven't drifted to a more liberal interpretation. They've drifted towards certainty. And I would suggest that that's because of this perceived threat. They feel threatened and certainly don't feel in a position to... I mean, I go back to my example. I would embrace the difficulties and try and find a solution, as opposed to recede to my community and pull down the shutters. That's what a lot of Muslims are doing, and I think they're suffering for it. But I would say, rather than this being an elegy, this is a phase that they're going through, and it's a temporary phase. So I think that's something that Muslims will work their way out of, but it's just uncomfortable for the time being.
Martyn has given quite a strong bid for communitarianism, for belonging together. I've heard a critique of that, which says actually the difficulty with communities is the thicker a community, the more you have to conform, the more you have to abide by the rules of that community. And a libertarian view is liberalism because it allows you to be an individual. As a sociologist, anything to say on that?
Well, I think that's right. And so you can see that people actually flee community. You know, as soon as we can leave the village, we go. It's happening in China now. People will go and live in the most appalling conditions in the city just to get away from thick community, because thick community is very oppressive to certain groups, particularly to women, to younger people. You know, community is not very nice on the whole. So the trick is to have what I'm talking about, some kind of means by which you can fully be who you are, argue for your position together, and then compromise. So you can be fully yourself, and yet you're trying to come to some common solution where you all get a bit, as much as you can, of what you want, but no one gets the whole thing. And maybe we haven't built enough institutions or everyday ways of living. That's an experiment in progress, I think. As more and more of us have more rights and more expectations, we need to rebuild institutions in ways that allow that kind of liberal engagement, and we haven't really done it. And the churches aren't attracted to people because they haven't done it either. It's a work in progress.
Thank you, Linda. I'm going to come back to you, Andrew, because I'd like to draw on your experience of being part of the Religious Education Council and working with a SACRA indeed. What role do you think religious education can play in building a better society?
Well,
Nice, easy question.
Yeah, easy. I think education about beliefs and values, and specifically about religions and other ultimate worldviews, has a massive role to play. But only to the same degree, I think, that the school as an institution has that role to play, because I think one of the, there's a sense in which education about beliefs and values will enable people to learn that other people have different beliefs from their own, and that those people exist, and that, of course, can happen in very homogenous schools, very culturally homogenous schools. But the bigger opportunities come, I think, when you have schools that draw pupils from a more diverse range of backgrounds, whether in ethnic terms or religion and belief terms. And there, I think the opportunities are immense, because, especially in the RE classroom, but in other contexts too within such schools, you have an opportunity to model the sort of community that you want to exist in the wider country, in the wider world. You have the opportunity to disagree respectfully, to perhaps change your mind, to challenge your own views, to understand another person's views and why they have them, and connect that with your own experience. So I think there's huge opportunities for RE to contribute. I think that almost nowhere in the country is it fulfilling its potential at the present time. There are some very good models of practice at the moment, but unfortunately very few. And I think the evidence actually is that especially government policy is attempting to drag us in a different direction. And the Church of England's view recently in its new educational resources have been very negative from this point of view, trying to draw the subject back to sort of almost a scriptural or biblical or theological approach to Christianity in particular, but to religion more generally. I think it would be much better if we were to use that subject as an opportunity to understand how we live in very plural societies together, and to be equipped young people with the tools to navigate that world. And then I think it offers great hope for the future.
Martyn, you wanted to...
Yeah, so to pick up on these last 2 points, I mean, it seems to me that, again, one of the problems we've had probably creeping up on us over the last I guess the post-war years, and it's been incremental, a sort of snowflake effect, I think, has been the gradual loss of confidence in institutions and much greater confidence in organisations. That has led us, unfortunately, I think, to have a lot of confidence in things that are apparently very clear and plain, but a loss of confidence in implicit things that we used to get through institutions that were hard to articulate. So if you think about the value of a college or a library or a gathering like this, actually we often learn as much, not by the formal lecturing, but by gatherings over tea, coffee and food. You know, that's just it. Conversation, semi-structured, actually is hugely educational. And it strikes me that when you start to look at the role of faith, and I think this is what Andrew was perhaps hinting at, to teach that isn't necessarily explicitly teaching about faith, it's actually teaching about how people get on. And it's structuring that into the curriculum. So one little illustration of this, a few years ago, I was invited to put on a class in the morning for a large group of Muslim young women of graduate age, so they're in their about 20s. And the task was, can you teach us the whole history of Christianity on Friday morning from 10 till noon? Piece of cake, so that's fine. So a graduate student was tasked with going to Wikipedia, that great source of infallible information, and picking off as many pictures as you possibly could so we could have a PowerPoint. So she picked off the Council of Jerusalem, Pentecost, Nicaea, Chalcedon, Synod of Whitby, Diet of Worms, Vatican I, Vatican II, Vatican IIID, the movie, the works really. All the Lambeth conferences you could think of and that sort of thing. And lots of pictures. And as I was doing this little kind of very sort of improvised talk, I thought, that's Christianity. It's a history of meetings.
Yeah.
It's history of meetings, actually, where we learnt to disagree and yet still hang out together. What do you think society is? What do you think last week's vote was about? And that's what we're losing. That's what religion can teach us. That's what liberalism can offer society, by being generous and by being orthodox. But until you have confidence in the institutions and the curriculum that can do that, we're a bit stuck. We'll just be doing aims, objectives and outcomes. So I've got great confidence in what we can do, and I think we can get this from our mosques as well. But I see no sign of this from our political or indeed from our church leaders at the moment.
Well, you've had some time of listening to the assembled wisdom of those of us who are gathered at the front of the library. What about you yourselves? Are there points or issues that you'd like to bring into the debate? Are there questions you'd like to put to all the panel or to any individual member. We have a couple of roving microphones, but let's open the debate to the perspectives we have amongst you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you all very much. I want to pick up some ideas about the tensions between liberalism and individualism, particularly picking up what Andrew said about choice and freedom of choice and freedom to choose. Andrew, at one point you said that human fulfillment rested in our ability to choose and to pursue freedom of choice. Whilst I think I would agree with you in some parts that liberalism is about human self-determination, free of external constraint, particularly external constraint of dogma or tradition or class or status or anything like that. I'm a little bit concerned about where the cult of choice might lead us, because I think liberalism is also about a tension and a balance between rights and responsibilities. And I just wonder at what point freedom of choice entered the liberal lexicon, if you like. And to put it bluntly, to say time, I wonder whether it's actually to do with justifying particular forms of capitalism and consumerism, rather than the kind of flourishing of the person who is the person in community, as some of the other people have been saying.
Excellent.
Okay, Andrew, would you like to respond?
Well, it's certainly a very popular view that the idea of choice enters liberalism at the same time as capitalism becomes dominant. And I think that there is certainly something in that. It's not a complete explanation. Obviously, the priority given to choice in liberalism is very useful to capitalism. That's certainly true. And it's useful for capitalism to stress those things, just as it's useful for many political and economic systems to try and grab some aspect of the predominant political or intellectual movement of the day and use it to justify its own hegemony. That's obviously true. But I don't think that you can say that choice comes in at that phase in human development. I mean, I still think that John Stuart Mill on liberty is the best manifesto for liberalism, not just because of what he says about politics and things like the harm principle, but because of what he says about the human person. But I would not make a cult of choice, certainly not. Plainly, all of our choices are constrained at least by the rights of other people, if nothing else, and certainly by the laws of physics in a more fundamental sense. So I don't know. I mean, that perhaps there's something in what I've said that I'm missing that seemed to imply that I was out, all out for choice for everyone. I think that the idea of having options, the idea of having the freedom to choose, the idea of not feeling constrained by your circumstances, by your environment, is important for human flourishing. I think people want to have something to look forward to. If they want to have something to look forward to, they need to be able to choose to get there, and how they're going to get there. But I wouldn't elevate it to a dogma. That's sort of my point.
It's worth saying that historians of religion think that the distinctive thing about Christianity is it's a decision-based religion. That's how it's different from Judaism and from religions you're born into. And then Islam is as well after that. But it's based on a decision. So you have to make a decision to be a follower, and that's why it's a kinship that can be anyone, depending whatever your ethnicity or your family, it becomes a universal community. So choice is pretty inherent in Christianity. It's a choice-based religion as well. It's got that long history. It's not just a secular modern
Indeed.
thing.
No, that's certainly true. All these ideas are tied together. I mean, didn't
Christians
Christianity
are very
give us
keen on
capitalism?
religious freedom these days.
Okay. Something Elaine raised about communalism, the importance of community, that's certainly central to the Islamic tradition.
It is. I mean, it's certainly part of the faith, the idea of community. But again, from my perspective nowadays, you see it as something that's being used defensively, understandably so. I gave this example not so long ago of I've got friends and family who live in East Lancashire in an area where there are a lot of Muslims and schools with 70% of the kids are from one background, Muslim Pakistani background, and you've got two communities that have very little to do with each other. And I would be very critical of them, and I'd go there and say that, look, in my street, I get Christmas cards off half the street. And you guys don't even talk to your next door neighbours. And it's outrageous. And I was looking down my nose a bit at them until they replied with, don't you think we've tried? Don't you think we've tried to engage with other people? But what happens is that my dad wants to move from this area, which isn't particularly good, to a nice part of town. And when he moves to the nice part of town, the for sale signs go up because people then think the neighbourhood's going down. And so if you don't feel welcome, you think, well, I might as well stick to my own where I feel safer. And especially now, especially with recent events and in recent times, people are more inclined and they certainly feel safer. And I've had this said to me only last week where my brother-in-law was saying that, you know what, at times like this, you're glad you're part of a community where others will be looking after your interests. And so, but that's not what I want a community to be, just to be there as a defensive mechanism. It should be something from which you project outwards. And it's that idea of community that I think certainly Muslims need to develop.
Thank you. Could we take another comment or question from the audience?
Martyn used the phrase just now, aims, objectives and outcomes to characterise a certain form of church management, I think. The other side of that is what's received, which is often characterised as a very infantilised kind of church. How do we actually handle that in terms of the discussion we've heard so far, where the possibility that we've got this receding church, which Linda described, or this receding ideal church, has been replaced by one in which congregations often do feel very infantilised by what they hear from the pulpit, and that seems to be something which is kind of dictated almost by the institution. Is that a fair comment?
Okay, Linda, do you want to have a go at that first?
There was a lovely study done of Catholic parishes in Birmingham, and the guy went around and talked to all the priests, and the priest said, I can't get the people to do anything. He's an accountant, and he's a this, and she's a that. But when they come to church, they won't do any of this. They don't. And he puzzled about this for ages, the researcher, and he thought exactly what you're saying. They've been infantilised, but the priest actually wants them to be doing those things, but both sides are. It doesn't work for either of them. And I think but it's happened for a long time somehow, hasn't it? And how you break out of that. And the phenomenon, I see this in my research often, talking to old ladies in church, and they say, oh yes, I'm reading Don Cupid, and I love this, but I wouldn't tell the vicar. And the vicar says, oh, well, I can't, I do preach a little bit. I don't like to frighten the people in the pew. And it's a conspiracy of silence on both halves, and neither really believe what they're pretending to the other one that they believe. It's kind of mad, but I don't know how we how we get out of that situation. Do you have any suggestions for de-infantilising?
Well, my personal prescription is that we recover confidence in the critical study of the Bible and discover it's a much richer topic than we thought.
Yeah.
And there's some very exciting new developments ahead if people would just invest some time and effort. I really do think that.
Yeah, people love talking about religion.
Martyn, you're a theological educator.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, I think, but of course it requires risk, but investment as well, I think, sometimes. I have a very fond memory, although a disturbed memory as well at the same time, of being invited to go and preach many years ago now at St James's Piccadilly. And I'd prepared my usual homily, really, and when I got there, Donald Reeve said, well, we're expecting about 45 minutes from you. So I thought, goodness me, okay, all right. So I sort of managed that. And at the end, the microphone was taken off me and then passed around the congregation. The sermon, therefore, lasted an hour and a half. But it was the second 45 minutes that I was very struck with. Full of rich, interesting insight from the congregation, lots of different ranges of opinions about the gospel reading. Why did you take it there? Why did you do that? Why did you not make that observation? Why did you not pick up on this verse? And they talked amongst each other. So a real, apologise for the idiom here, a real community of learning that was prepared to take risks with one another and took risks with people in the congregation who had no idea what the gospel of the day was or what it meant. But nonetheless, it was actually the story about the woman caught in adultery. So there's plenty to say, and plenty of material for people to work with. But it was extraordinary. I don't think I've encountered it anywhere else. I think I want to know why.
Zia, did you want to contribute?
Just to add this, however infantilized you think discussions in the church might be, you need to get yourself down to a mosque and see what happens there. Because it's frightening that these are mosques that are overflowing, and yet the quality of the sermons on a Friday afternoon are just mind-numbing. And I remember once having a conversation with a rabbi who was telling me about his experience in Liverpool, and he said that in my synagogue, there's one of the people who comes along is the senior judge in Liverpool, Mr. Globe, and he said it's a nightmare when he comes. And I said, why? And he said, well, because he analyses every last sentence that I utter and asks me questions about it and pulls me up on things. Well, what about this and what about that? And I said to the rabbi, you should get yourself down to the mosque. Firstly, they wouldn't even realise you're a Jew because you've got a beard, so you'll fit right in, and I can guarantee you no one will ask you any questions. And this is the sort of the sorry state of the Muslim community at the moment, where the idea of questioning faith and exploring, that just seems to be put to one side, and you go and you get the same sort of staple diet of this is how you practice your religion. And so, as I say, you've got nothing to worry about for the time being.
Okay, any further questions or comments from the audience? Sir?
I think Zia made the point about 1,000 years ago Islam was much more liberal because of the accumulation of wealth and learning. And my question really is, this is the fundamental point of the gap between the rich and the poor, because surely over a period of time, what has happened, we have materially become enriched, yet spiritually the need of human beings of greed and of anger and of hatred seem to have enhanced. And certainly at the top of the very wealthy today, you have greed which is unbelievable. How do we actually cure that? How do we stop that? Because it's been going on from time immemorial. How do we deal with that growing gap between rich and poor?
Well, that's a very big sociological question indeed. I wonder which way I should bowl this one. Let's go to Martyn.
The growing gap. I guess I'd want to start again with a rebooted conversation about this. Again, it goes right to the nature of our society. A question about what our churches and our faith communities are for, what their responsibilities and obligations are. I think increasingly there's a consciousness here about being responsible for our neighbours. So I see, some growing evidence of churches being much more intentional about food banks and credit unions and other things. I'm really heartened by these things. I truly am. At the same time, we have other drivers in the church, certainly the Church of England at the moment, which is much more about bums on pews and huge anxiety about membership speak and lots of the signs or apparent fruits of individualism and growth. And I'm quite clear about which way I think I would want our church to head. I'm less interested in bums on pews. I'm much more interested in bums off pews and out in the community. And doing something that's a tangible sign of the kingdom. And that's in the end where these theological debates are for me. They're back with that incredibly instructive, very vibrant theology that we had in the 60s and 70s, which wasn't asking much about the church. It was asking, what is the nature of this kingdom of God that Jesus preached for our world today? What should we be about as a people? And that would, I think, go some way towards answering the questions about what to do about the gap between the rich and the poor. Because I think the kingdom of God and the teaching on that has quite a lot to say about it.
Andrew, a humanist perspective on the gap in wealth.
Well, obviously, the gaps in wealth. There's a great book by a humanist member of the VHA called Kate Pickett, the spirit level, which has demonstrated pretty conclusively that gaps, even small gaps, even quite small gaps in wealth from richest to poorest, have devastating social effects. And in countries and in parts of the world and in parts of countries where that gap is larger, greater social problems ensue. So obviously it's something that has to be dealt with. I would obviously try and deal with big social problems by looking at the evidence and taking political solutions. I'm sure that religious groups have a role to play, just as other civil society organisations have, like the big secular charities like Oxfam and Save the Children that have driven these debates forward and had such massive effects on raising public consciousness, much bigger, I'd imagine, than many other civil society organisations have done. But no doubt religious groups have a role to play in that conversation and generating that sort of social recognition that these are problems. But the solutions won't come by small, piecemeal, grassroots initiatives. They'll come on a global level through politics, of course. So that is where I would want to see people get involved.
Linda?
Well, two very different thoughts. One is, Andrew's right, of course, the only thing that can be... The power is vested in corporations increasingly. The only thing that can control them is states, is politics. But there needs to be much better joined up political mechanisms worldwide to deal with floating corporations and capital. And we haven't got that, and we're not thinking creatively enough about that. That's a huge structural issue. But I'd say one more optimistic thing about our society. We can be pessimistic, but actually the gains we've had in the last few decades are enormous, the moral gains. So the fact that we now listen to children and take their voices seriously and don't dismiss them, the way we deal with sexual abuse, the way in which gender equality has been handled, the way in which sexuality and gay people, these are enormous moral advances. So it's not just that we're going backwards, and we have to celebrate just how big those moral shifts have been in case we go back on them.
I mean, I think that's a really important point, and maybe we should go back to it to sort of try and just contest a little bit what you've said, is that I think that there's plenty of reason to think that not just Britain but the world has got better and better and better in the last few hundred years. I mean, you know, it always seems to many people, no doubt, at whatever point in the history of the world and wherever on the globe they happen to be living, that things are pretty awful in one way or another. But the great book by Steven Pinker a couple of years ago, Better Angels, which is where he tried to take a step back and look at a couple of thousand years of human history and look at the incidents of armed conflict today, the way that we think about other people today. You know, things are getting better all the time. I don't say that in a sort of wide-eyed, dreamy, utopian sense, that I think that progress is inevitable or ongoing or it's going to last forever. I certainly don't. It's very precious and fragile and needs to be you know, constantly built up. But it is the case that things on all sorts of measures have got better. And giving us hope that we might reach the sort of solutions in due course that Linda says we need. We're far better now, for example, at thinking of other people in countries far away as being human beings like ourselves than we have ever been, you know, I think, in the history of the world. And that's a great humanistic, whether it's a humanist one or not, a humanistic achievement of the last couple of centuries, which I think should give us cause for at least qualified optimism.
Well, we're almost drawing now towards the time for tea. And I'm sure that the discussions can go on over tea and cake in a moment. I'd like to ask one last thing of our panellists, and they didn't know this was coming, so they'll be having to think off the top of their head. But we did hear quite a lot of optimism towards the end, that there are good things happening and there are things which are signs of hope. And I wonder whether I could ask our panellists to identify one thing that they think is a positive sign of hope, and they feel that we could all play our part in building in society in the next few weeks, months, in the days ahead. Linda?
The way we respect children. So not as deficit adults, but as human beings, with really interesting views and things to say, and we don't really have a way of listening and taking those views seriously as a society yet, but we're starting to listen and believe children, and I think that's a one. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Zia?
I think it's a great positive that it's dawned on many, if not most of us, that a world in which the 60 richest people are worth the same as the poorest 3.5 billion simply is immoral and unsustainable. And I think that realization is the starting point of turning things round.
Thank you very much. Andrew?
I think the practical revolution in morality that began, a couple of hundred years ago to get seriously off the ground, where people around the world, as we were saying a moment ago, really started to believe that other human beings in other parts of the world were people like them, and that regardless of gender or race or tribe, that was a possibility, not just that they were like them in terms of having a right to equal dignity and choice and so on, but literally related as part of a whole human family, and we all came from the same place. I think that is a positive development. And there are many parts of the world where that is an incomplete revolution. There are many countries in the world where the majority of the population will still say that black people and white people and Arabs are descended from different species, for example. So I think that the wider spread of that idea and the fact that it's gaining ground and currency across not just the Western world but the world, I think, is a great cause for hope.
Martyn?
So a comment and then one tiny story to end. It's something of a cliche to say, isn't it, that the Chinese character for crisis and opportunity is the same, but it is. And you could look at our current times and you could despair. You could really wonder about the kind of mess we've got ourselves into. I think in all of this, it's really important that we don't lose hope. And hope is, of all the three things Paul said, probably the greatest. I beg to differ with Paul at the end of 1 Corinthians 13, but hope might be the greatest thing. And hope is not just sitting there hoping for better things. Hope is generative, it is proactive. You have to make hope realisable. Andrew mentioned Oxfam. Next year, 75 years old. It began in a time very similar to ours, with an enforced Grexit, because the Nazis had invaded Greece and it was starving, literally starving. And people gathered together in Oxford, wanting to know what on earth to do about their starving fellow Europeans. And they started to bring gifts. The people who actually started to collect these wanted a warehouse off the city council. They couldn't get it. And they got a shop instead in Broad Street that started to collect pennies, jewellery, butter. The people managing this warehouse realised you couldn't send butter to Greece or jewellery, but you could sell it. And that was the first charity shop in this country, the very first. And that gives birth to Oxfam, and that gave money to Greece. And now Oxfam is active in 80 countries in the world. You don't need to be religious to be a supporter of Oxfam, but I think you do need to be hopeful. You need to be hopeful about what you can do in society together with your neighbour for people on the other sides of the world you value and you've never met. And faith and humanism both have contributions to make to that. But do not despair, hope, and do something about your hope.
Well, a very great thank you to all our panellists this afternoon. We hope that Gladstone's library can always be a place for honest, respectful, intellectual, faith-filled, humanist-filled, every sort of tradition that you can imagine, that we can come here and debate and learn from one another. And I think that's been modelled in the sort of discussion that we've had this afternoon. I'm extremely grateful to Linda and to Zia, to Martyn and to Andrew for giving their time and their readiness to be put on the spot from time to time in this panel this afternoon. And I hope we can express our appreciation of their thoughts and their wisdom in the usual fashion now.